Come in. Sit down. Let the world outside do its own thing for a while. Pull the blanket up if you have one nearby. Turn the lamp down low or off altogether if the dark suits you better tonight. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to solve. For the next little while, the only task in front of you is to listen and to let your body settle into whatever surface is holding it up. Somewhere behind you, if you are in a city, there may be a bakery. You may not think about it often. It is simply there, the way the street lamp outside your window is there, part of the furniture of a place you live in without quite noticing. But tonight, we are going somewhere that most people who have ever bought a loaf of bread have never seen and never thought to ask about. We are going down below the street, below the shop front with its clean glass and its neat rows of loaves, into a room that is hot when the world above is freezing and dark when the world above is only just beginning to think about waking. A room where a boy not yet grown into his own shoulders spends the whole of the night with his arms buried in dough, so that by the time you or I might have woken up in his century, warm bread was simply waiting, as if it had always been there, as if no one had made it at all. Tonight we are going to spend a full day and night with him. We will watch him wake in the evening, when most households were banking their fires and going to bed. We will follow him down a ladder into a cellar in London in the year 1861, and we will stay with him until the ovens finally go cold and the street above him is bright and busy and entirely unaware of what it took to get there. There is no need to hold on to any of it too tightly. Let it arrive the way a story arrives when someone you trust is telling it to you slowly, without hurry. The fire low and the night long. That is what we are here for. Get comfortable, friend. We are about to go somewhere real. Tonight we are going to follow a baker's apprentice through one full working day in London in the winter of 1861, from the moment his day begins in darkness to the moment it ends in the pale hour after dawn, when the rest of the city is only just sitting down to breakfast. The version you probably carry in your mind is almost entirely wrong. This is a channel about people whose names rarely made it into any history book, followed closely enough for one full day at a time that they start to feel like someone you actually know. Tonight that person is a baker's apprentice, and the trade he practices happens to sit underneath one of the most comforting, most universally loved smells a city can offer. If I asked you to picture a 19th century bakery, you would likely see something pleasant. A shop window fogged faintly with warmth, rows of crusty loaves cooling on wire racks, a cheerful man in a flour-dusted apron, wiping his hands on a cloth, calling out a good morning to a passing customer. It is a comforting picture, and it is not entirely a lie. There was a shop, and there was bread, and there probably was a cheerful greeting exchanged over the counter at some point in the day. But that shop was only the last few feet of a much longer and much harder story, and almost none of that story happened where the customer could see it. Beneath nearly every bakery of any size in London at this time was a cellar, and in that cellar, through the entire night, a small number of men and boys did something that had far more in common with ironwork or coal mining than with the gentle domestic image the word bakery tends to conjure. They worked in suffocating heat beside brick ovens fired by coal or wood. They breathed air thick enough with flour to taste. They kneaded by hand because no machine yet existed to do it for them. Hundreds of pounds of dough at a stretch, night after night, for years of their young lives. Before we go any further, I want to say something to you directly, because I mean it. If evenings like this one have become part of how you wind down, if you find something worth keeping in these long, unhurried walks through other centuries, I would be grateful if you considered subscribing. It costs you nothing, and it helps this odd little channel keep going. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are tonight, and what time it happens to be where you are sitting or lying down right now. I read every one, and it is a strange, quiet pleasure to to picture all of you scattered across so many different clocks, listening to the same story at once. Wherever and whenever you are, my friend, I am glad of the company. By the time we reach the end of this one, I think you will never smell fresh bread quite the same way again. Not because the smell will trouble you, but because you will finally know what it cost and who paid it. We will watch flour come down from a storeroom in sacks heavier than the boy carrying them. We will watch a fire built inside the very oven that will later bake the bread, since these ovens had no separate firebox the way a modern reader might expect. We will watch dough worked entirely by hand, because no machine capable of doing that work existed yet, not for a shop this size, not in this year. And we will watch the sun come up over a city that will eat its breakfast without ever once wondering how the bread got there. It is a little past 11 at night, in a narrow street in Clerkenwell, and somewhere below the cobblestones, a lamp has just been lit. It is 1861, and London is the largest city the world has ever held, though it does not always feel that way from inside a narrow street at night. The gas lamps run in a thin orange chain down Turnmill Street in Clerkenwell, each one throwing a small circle of light onto wet cobbles and leaving the spaces between them almost entirely black. It is January, and the cold has a wet, clinging quality to it, the kind that gets into wool coats and stays there. Above the rooftops, the sky carries the low orange smear that coal smoke leaves over a city at night, so thick in places that a person can taste it at the back of the throat before they can see it. London itself, in these years, is expanding faster than its own maps can quite keep pace with, new streets pushing outward into fields that were still open pasture within living memory, railways cutting fresh lines through neighbourhoods that had stood unchanged for generations. It is a city of astonishing wealth in some quarters and grinding poverty in others, sometimes only a short walk apart, and a city that runs day and night on an enormous, largely invisible quantity of manual labour performed by people whose names appear in no history book and whose faces were rarely thought worth painting. Clerkenwell in these years is a crowded tangle of small trades. Watchmakers and jewellers work in upper rooms behind narrow windows. Printers run presses in converted stables. There are tanneries nearby and breweries, and the smell of the whole district shifts depending on which way the wind turns. Hops 1 hour, hide and tallow the next, coal smoke always underneath everything else like a held note. It is not a fashionable part of London, and it is not the poorest either. It sits in the crowded middle, full of people who work with their hands for other people who sell what those hands have made. The buildings lining Turnmill Street are mostly brick, 3 and 4 stories, blackened along their upper courses by decades of coal smoke settling out of the air the way snow settles in a cleaner climate. Shop fronts occupy the ground floor of most of them, small panes of glass set in wooden frames. The family living above the shop rather than apart from it, since keeping trade and household under one roof saves a rent that few tradesmen here can spare twice over. Slate roofs where they can be afforded, or plain tile where they cannot, slope down toward gutters that will, come the next real rain, do their imperfect best to carry the water away from foundations already old enough to have settled unevenly into the London clay beneath them. At this hour, most windows are dark. A watchman's lantern moves slowly at the far end of the street. A cat crosses in front of it and vanishes into a doorway. Somewhere a horse shifts its weight in a stable, the sound of a hoof against stone carrying oddly far in the quiet. The city that will be loud and crowded and impossible to hear yourself think in by 9 in the morning is, at 11 at night, almost entirely asleep. A night soil man passes at the far end of the street with his cart, moving between houses that have no other way of clearing what a modern reader would simply flush away, and the smell of that trade lingers a moment before the cold air carries it off. A watchman calls the hour somewhere 2 streets over, his voice thin and half swallowed by the fog that has begun creeping up from the river. These are the people who belong to London's night, a small, scattered population of watchmen, carters, night soil men, and the occasional constable on his beat, moving through a city that the daylight population would barely recognize as the same place, almost because behind one particular shopfront on Turnmill Street, a shopfront with the name Hollis painted in gold letters above the window, and a display of nothing at all behind the glass at this hour, a door at the side of the building stands slightly open, and a set of worn stone steps leads down into the dark. This is where our night begins. There is a distinctive quality to London fog in a winter like this one, thick with coal smoke from tens of thousands of household grates and countless small workshops, that settles low over streets like this and turns even the gas lamps into soft, swollen smears of orange rather than clean points of light. It gets into clothing and hair and the backs of throats, a taste more than a smell after a while, and Londoners of this era have grown so accustomed to it that a truly clear night, when it comes, feels almost strange, almost too sharp, the way silence can feel loud to an ear grown used to constant low noise. A working person in London in 1861 lives inside a fairly narrow set of numbers, and it is worth knowing them before we go any further, because they will explain almost everything that follows. A skilled tradesman, someone with a proper trade behind him, might bring home somewhere between 18 shillings and £1 in an ordinary week. A labourer without a trade would be doing well to see 12. Rent for 2 poor rooms in a district like this one might run to 4 or 5 shillings a week. Sometimes more, depending on how close you wanted to be to your work and how much damp you were willing to tolerate in exchange for cheapness. A quartern loaf of bread, the £4 loaf that fed a family for a day or two, depending on how many mouths there were to feed, cost somewhere around 7p, though the exact figure moved with the price of wheat the way a boat moves with the tide, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The numbers are worth pausing over, because they tell you something the shopfront never will. Bread was not a luxury in this city. It was the floor beneath everything else, the first thing a family budgeted for and the last thing they would give up. Meat was for those who could afford it regularly, which was not most people. Bread, day after day, spread thin with a little dripping if you were lucky, was what actually kept a family alive between one payday and the next, which meant the bakery on the corner was not simply a shop. It was closer to a small, essential utility, as necessary and as unremarkable as a well. And a business that essential, in a city that large, needed to run every night of the year, because a city does not wait patiently for its breakfast. It expects the loaf to already be there, warm or at least fresh, sitting in the window by the time the first clerks and labourers are making their way to work. Someone has to make certain of that. Someone has to be awake while the rest of the street sleeps, coaxing several £100 of flour and water into something that will rise and bake and be ready by the hour the city demands it. Let us go down the steps and see what that actually looks like. The stone steps descending from the side door are narrow, worn into a shallow dip in the middle from decades of boots, and they turn once before they reach the bottom. There is no railing. A person learns quickly to trail one hand along the damp brick wall, because the light down here for now is nothing more than the faint orange glow leaking from beneath a door at the bottom, along with whatever a single tallow candle somewhere inside can manage. The air changes before the eyes do. It is the first thing anyone notices, coming down. The cold, clinging London night gives way, within a few steps, to something warmer, closer, and heavier. It smells of scorched brick and old ash. It smells, faintly and constantly, of flour, not the clean floury smell of a kitchen counter, but something denser, almost dusty enough to have a texture of its own. The kind of smell that settles into wool and skin and does not entirely wash out. Underneath that is the ghost of yesterday's baking, a warm, faintly sweet must that never quite leaves a working bakehouse, no matter how thoroughly it is swept. At the bottom of the steps is a low, brick vaulted room, no more than perhaps 20 feet by 15, with a ceiling low enough that a tall man would need to mind his head near the arch of the oven. One wall is dominated by the oven itself, a squat brick structure with a heavy iron door, cold now but already being prepared. Along the opposite wall stands a long wooden trough, scarred pale in places from years of scraping and kneading, deep enough to hold flour by the sack. Sacks themselves are stacked in a corner, along with a barrel of water, a scattering of wooden peels with long handles leaning against the wall like a strange collection of oars, and, folded on a shelf, a few worn blankets that serve, on some nights, as the only bedding this room will offer anyone. There is a single gas jet fixed to the wall, its light thin and greenish, throwing more shadow than illumination. There is a small window at street level, more grate than glass, entirely useless for daylight and only slightly less useless for air. Ventilation, in the modern sense of the word, does not exist down here. What air there is comes down the same steps the men do, or seeps in through the grate, or simply gets breathed and rebreathed as the night goes on, thickening with flour dust and coal smoke and the close, airless heat of a small underground room in which a fire is about to be built and kept burning for hours. This is a bakehouse. Not the shop above, with its clean counter and its painted sign, but the actual working heart of the business. The room in which the bread that will feed several hundred households tomorrow is, at this exact moment, still only flour, water, and the memory of yesterday's fire in the brick. A candle moves near the far wall. A young voice, not yet fully a man's voice, mutters something to itself about the cold of the steps and the promise of warmth ahead. This corner of London had been building bread this way for a very long time, and would go on doing so for a while yet, since brick holds its heat the same way regardless of which century is asking it to. A shop like this one might change hands from father to son 2 or 3 times across 100 years. The sign repainted, the counter replaced, but the cellar beneath it, the trough, the oven, the low ceiling that makes a tall man mind his head, these tend to outlast whoever happens to be working in them at any given moment, patient in a way that the people passing through them rarely get to be. Let us go closer and meet him properly. His name is Thomas Yardley, though almost no one down here calls him that. To the man he works for, he is Tom. To the older journeyman who shares this cellar with him most nights, he is occasionally boy, which he has stopped minding, and occasionally something less polite, which he has also stopped minding. Mostly, he is 17 years old, tall for his age but not yet filled out into it, with forearms that have grown noticeably thicker over the last 3 years, and a faint permanent paleness to his skin that has nothing to do with illness and everything to do with spending his working life underground and his sleeping hours behind drawn curtains against the daylight. Tom is an apprentice, bound by indenture to his master for a term of 7 years, of which this is the 3rd. An indenture, if the word is unfamiliar, was a formal legal contract drawn up and signed, binding a boy to a master tradesman for a set number of years. During that time, the boy owed his labour entirely to the master. In exchange, the master owed him instruction in the trade, along with board and lodging, though rarely anything so generous as a wage. Tom will not see a shilling of pay for the work he does tonight, or any night this year. What he receives instead is food, a place to sleep, and, slowly, the knowledge in his hands and shoulders that will one day let him call himself a journeyman baker and earn a wage of his own. His master is Josiah Hollis, a broad, quiet man of about 45 who has run the shop on Turnmill Street for close to 20 years, having taken it over from his own father in turn. Mr. Hollis is not a cruel master, which Tom has come to understand. Over 3 years of listening to other apprentices talk is worth being grateful for. He does not strike his boys without cause. He shares out the food fairly. He is, however, a tired man, worn thin by 2 decades of the same nightly labour Tom is only 3 years into, and there are nights when his temper is short and his patience shorter, and Tom has learnt to read the set of his shoulders the way a sailor reads weather. Above the cellar, in the rooms over the shop, lives the rest of the household. Mrs. Anne Hollis manages the counter, the accounts, and, in practice, a fair portion of her husband's temper as well. She is a sharp, capable woman who can weigh a loaf by eye to within an ounce and knows every regular customer's habits well enough to have their order half wrapped before they finish speaking. There are 2 Hollis children, a girl of 9 and a boy of 6, who Tom sees mostly at odd hours, sleepy-eyed at the top of the cellar stairs on a Sunday morning, curious about the strange nocturnal world their father and the apprentice disappear into every night. And there is Walter Pratt, 26 years old, a journeyman baker who is paid a wage for his work here, unlike Tom, and who has therefore earned the right, in his own estimation at least, to comment freely on Tom's kneading technique, his posture, and his prospects. Tom's days, if we can still call them days when they run so thoroughly backward from everyone else's, are structured around the single unbending fact of the trade. Bread must be ready by morning. Everything else arranges itself around that one requirement. He rises, if rises is the word for a boy who has slept only a few broken hours, in the early evening eats whatever supper Mrs. Hollis has set aside, and is down the cellar steps by 10:30 most nights. Sometimes earlier if there is a large order for a wedding breakfast or a charitable dinner that requires extra loaves. He will not properly lie down again until well past noon the following day. In between lies the whole of the night's labour, which we are about to watch him begin. Tom's own family lives across the river, a carter's household with 5 children of whom Tom is the second eldest, and he sees them rarely now, perhaps once every few weeks on a Sunday afternoon when the shop's trade allows him an hour or 2 away. His mother worries in the quiet, familiar way mothers of this period tend to worry about sons sent out to learn a trade, that the work is wearing him thinner than it should, and she is not entirely wrong, though Tom has learned to reassure her with a cheerfulness that costs him more effort than he lets on. His father, for his part, asks few questions and offers fewer opinions, trusting that 7 years under Mr. Hollis's roof will deliver, in the end, exactly what was promised when the indenture was signed. A trade, a set of hands that can earn their own wage, and a future meaningfully steadier than the uncertain, weather-dependent work of hauling goods through London's streets that has occupied his own life. Here is a detail that makes him more than simply a type, more than merely an apprentice baker, the way a history book might file him away. Tom reads, not often, and not for long stretches, because there is little time and less light to spare for it, but he has a cheap, much folded copy of a penny publication that runs adventure stories in installments, and he keeps it tucked behind a loose brick near his sleeping corner, and on the rare night when the work goes smoothly and there is a lull before the ovens need tending, he will pull it out by candle stub and read a page or 2, moving his lips slightly the way people do when reading is still new enough to require some effort. Walter teases him about it. Mr. Hollis pretends not to notice, though Tom suspects he does. It is a small, private pleasure, the kind that makes a person rather than simply a set of hands attached to a trade, and Tom guards it carefully, the way you might guard anything small and warm in a life that offers very little softness. Tom's physical bearing has begun, in small ways, to mark him as belonging to this trade specifically, the way a blacksmith carries himself differently than a clerk, or a waterman differently than a tailor. The muscles across his back and shoulders have thickened noticeably beyond what a boy his age doing lighter work might show, while his colour remains, even now in the depths of winter, when everyone's complexion runs paler, distinctly wan. The indoor pallor of someone who spends his working hours entirely by gaslight and firelight rather than daylight. Walter, older and further along the same path, shows the pattern more clearly still, forearms like a stevedore's, a faint permanent hoarseness to his voice that he attributes, probably correctly, to years of the flower-laden air. Tonight is, in most respects, an ordinary night. There is no special order weighing on the household, no wedding, no unusual quantity of flour to move through the trough before dawn. Which is precisely why it is worth spending our time here. An ordinary night, followed honestly from its first minute to its last, tells you more about a life than any single dramatic one ever could. Tonight there will be the usual quantity of bread, the usual number of loaves for the usual number of customers. And Tom will do the usual work, which is to say a great deal of physically brutal labor performed so consistently and so invisibly that no one above ground will spare it a single thought tomorrow morning. There is, in a sense, a schedule to all of this, though it exists nowhere on paper. It lives instead in the rhythm of the trade itself, passed down from master to apprentice the way the recipes are, through repetition rather than instruction. The fire must be built and the oven brought to heat by a certain point in the night. The dough must be mixed and left to rise for a certain number of hours, which cannot be rushed no matter how tired the hands doing the mixing happen to be. Because yeast keeps its own clock and answers to no one. The loaves must be shaped, proved a second time, and baked in careful sequence, so that the last batch comes out of the oven just as the first customers are arriving above, wanting their bread while it still carries some warmth. Every hour of Tom's night is, in this sense, already spoken for, dictated by the slow biological patience of fermenting dough and the unforgiving mathematics of a city that wants its breakfast at a fixed hour, whether or not the people making it have had any sleep at all. He shares his small sleeping corner of the household with no one now, though in the earlier years of his apprenticeship he had bedded down alongside another boy, a fellow apprentice since moved along to a different master's shop across the city, and Tom still feels the absence of that easy, whispered companionship some nights. The two of them, once trading complaints about aching arms in the dark before sleep, finally took them both. Walter has, in his own rougher way, filled some part of that gap, though a paid journeyman 5 years his senior can never quite replace the comfort of a fellow apprentice serving out the exact same sentence at the exact same pace. There is, too, a private ambition Tom carries, one he has confided only to Walter, and even then only once, on a slow night with the ovens still building heat and little else to occupy the conversation. He would like, eventually, once his own 7 years are served and his journeyman's wage is his to keep, to save enough to take a small shop of his own somewhere out past the crowded centre, in one of the newer streets going up where London keeps pushing further into the surrounding fields. It is a modest ambition, nothing grand, but it is his, privately held and rarely spoken, and it gives the long, punishing nights a shape they might otherwise lack. A sense that the aching arms and the flour-choked air are purchasing something specific rather than simply being endured for their own sake. He reaches the bottom of the steps now, candle stub cupped against the draught, and sets it down on a ledge beside the trough. Above him, the house is dark and quiet, the Hollis family asleep in their beds. Below, in this low brick room, the night's work is about to begin, and it begins, as it always does, with the fire. It is 11 o'clock, and the fire comes first. Tom crouches before the oven's low iron door and works it open on a hinge that complains every single night in the same tired voice. Inside, the brick is cold and pale with the ash of yesterday's baking, faint traces of soot still clinging to the arched roof of the oven's interior. He rakes the old ash forward with a long iron tool, careful of the dust it throws up, careful too of his own breathing, though he has long since stopped thinking of the reflexive half-turn of his head as anything other than habit. The ash goes into a bucket. What remains is a clean bed of brick, ready to be fed. He builds the fire the way he was taught in his first month here, kindling first, a careful tent of split wood, then coal, added gradually once the flame has caught and steadied. Coal is what Hollis uses most nights now, being more reliable and, when bought in the right quantity from the right merchant, somewhat cheaper by the pound than wood, though wood still gets used for the initial catch because it lights faster and burns hotter in those first crucial minutes. The fire has to be built directly inside the oven chamber itself, since this is not an oven with a separate firebox the way a modern reader might picture. It is what bakers of the period call a direct-fired oven, meaning the fire burns right where the bread will eventually sit, and once the brick has absorbed enough heat, the fire and its ash are raked out entirely, and the loaves go into bake in the residual heat held inside the brick itself, the way a stone retains warmth from the sun long after the sun has gone down. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you understand it. The oven is not a modern appliance holding a steady, controlled temperature. It is closer to a great clay battery, charged by fire and then discharged slowly into bread. Getting that charge right, judging by eye and by the exact pale color the brick takes on when it has reached the correct heat, is one of the genuine skills of the trade. One that takes years to learn properly, and that Mr. Hollis still checks on personally most nights, even with Tom 3 years into his training. Somewhere above, faint through the brick and the floorboards, a church bell strikes the half-hour, the sound arriving down here thinned and distant, as though it belongs to a different building entirely, rather than simply a different floor of the same one. Tom has come to measure his whole night by these muffled bells, since there is no clock down here worth the expense, and a boy learns quickly to read 11:30 or 2:15 by the pattern of strikes carrying down through the ceiling, the same way a sailor learns to read a ship's bell without needing to think about it. Walter Pratt comes down the steps a few minutes after Tom, moving with the unhurried economy of a man who has done this exact walk several thousand times before. He is a solidly built young man, quick with an opinion and quicker with a complaint about the cold, and he greets Tom with a grunt that passes, between the two of them, for a perfectly cordial good evening. "Fire's slow tonight," Walter says, glancing at the oven. "It caught fine," Tom says. "You're just cold. I'm always cold. Ask my mother." It is the kind of exchange that means nothing and everything at once, the small currency of two people who spend more waking hours in each other's company than either of them spends with anyone else in his life, family included. Walter has been a journeyman for 4 years now, having served his own apprenticeship under a different master across the river before coming to work for Hollis, and there is an easy, older brother quality to how he treats Tom, equal parts genuine instruction and casual mockery, delivered so thoroughly mixed together that Tom has largely stopped trying to separate the two. Before the flour comes down, there is the matter of tonight's order to settle, and Mr. Hollis calls down briefly from the top of the steps to confirm it, since a large christening order due tomorrow means slightly more dough than an ordinary night requires. Tom listens, doing the quiet arithmetic in his head that 3 years of this trade have made almost automatic. An extra sack of flour, an extra hour perhaps before the last batch can go in. It is a small adjustment, the kind that would mean nothing at all to the family collecting their christening loaves tomorrow afternoon, and everything to the 2 men who will have to find that extra hour somewhere inside a night that was already fully spoken for. While the oven builds its heat, the flour comes down. This is one of Tom's regular jobs, and it is not a small one. The sacks are kept in a dry storeroom just off the cellar, and each one weighs close to 200 pounds, far more than Tom himself weighs, and moving them from storeroom to trough is a matter of leverage and momentum rather than raw strength. A technique it took him the better part of a year to learn without hurting his back. He drags the first sack across the brick floor, tips it against the edge of the trough, and works the opening loose. Flour spills out in a pale, dusty cascade, catching what little light the gas jet offers and turning it soft and diffuse, like fog inside a lantern. The flour goes into the trough, along with measured water, warmed slightly at the fire's edge, and a portion of leaven kept back from a previous batch, since this bakehouse, like most of its kind in 1861, does not yet have easy access to the small dried cakes of manufactured yeast that will become common decades later. The leaven is a kind of living inheritance, a piece of fermented dough held back each night specifically to start the next night's batch. Meaning the bread on Turnmill Street tomorrow carries, in some small living sense, the yeast of every loaf that came before it, stretching back through years of the shop's history. Tom finds something quietly remarkable in this, though he has never said so aloud to Walter, who would almost certainly find a way to make fun of him for it. Now comes the part of the night that will occupy most of the coming hours, and that any visitor from the street above would find almost unrecognizable as the gentle, flowery business they imagine baking to be. There is no machine in this room or in almost any bakehouse in London at this time that will do the mixing and kneading for them. That labor belongs entirely to human arms, human shoulders, and human backs, and it will belong to them for a long while yet, since a reliable mechanical dough mixer suited to a working bakehouse of this size does not really exist as a practical, affordable option for a shop like Hollis's, not in 1861, and not for some years still to come. Tom rolls his sleeves to the elbow, already faintly damp with the first sweat the growing oven heat has drawn out of him, and plants both hands into the mass of flour and water in the trough. It is heavy in a way that resists easy description until you have felt it yourself. 100 pounds or more of thickening paste, clinging and stubborn, does not want to be turned or folded. It wants to sit exactly where it has been poured, and every single motion of kneading it into something workable has to be won from it by force, leaning the whole weight of the body forward over the trough's edge, then pulling back, then forward again, over and over, the shoulders doing most of the true work while the arms and hands merely direct it. Within a few minutes, Tom's forearms are burning in that deep, muscular way that has nothing to do with injury and everything to do with simple, repeated effort. Within 20 minutes, his shirt is sticking to his back, despite the January cold that still lingers faintly at the bottom of the cellar steps. This is the part of the trade that the shop above never shows anyone, and it is worth saying plainly because the gap between the two pictures is the whole point of tonight. The customer who will stand at that counter tomorrow morning, coins in hand, admiring a crusty golden loaf still faintly warm, has no reason to imagine any of this. She pictures, if she pictures anything at all, a cheerful man with flour on his apron humming perhaps, engaged in some pleasant domestic craft not unlike her own bread making at home, only on a larger scale. What she does not picture is a 17-year-old boy, soaked through with sweat in a suffocating brick cellar at midnight, arms trembling with effort, breathing air thick enough with flour dust to coat the back of his throat, performing labor that will, within a decade or two, begin visibly bending the spines and thickening the joints of the men who do it for a living. Walter works the second trough beside him, and for a while neither of them talks much, since conversation and hard kneading do not mix especially well. The only sounds are the wet, heavy slap and drag of dough being turned, the occasional clink of the oven door being checked, and, somewhere above, faint through the ceiling boards, the creak of the Hollis house settling in its sleep. Somewhere in the middle of all this, without ever quite pausing to acknowledge it, Tom has crossed fully into the state of mind that carries a person through this kind of labor, a narrowing of attention down to the immediate task and nothing beyond it. The ache in his shoulders acknowledged and set aside, rather than dwelt upon. The hours ahead simply accepted as a distance to be covered, rather than counted anxiously one by one. It is not quite resignation, and it is not quite pride either, though it borrows a little from both. It is, more than anything, the discipline of a trade that offers no reward for hurrying and no mercy for those who cannot pace themselves against a night this long. It is nearly midnight now, and the first dough is starting to come together under Tom's hands, no longer a loose, sloppy mass, but something with a bit of spring and resistance to it. Something that fights back, gently, when he presses a knuckle into it. He knows this feeling well by now. It is the feeling of dough deciding, slowly, to become bread. Good enough, Walter says, checking Tom's trough with a practiced press of 2 fingers. Cover it and let it think about its life for a while. Tom laughs despite himself, a short, tired sound and drapes a damp cloth over the trough. The dough will sit now, for hours, rising slowly in the cellar's steady warmth, while the two of them turn their attention to the next round of preparation. And the fire in the oven continues its patient work of charging the brick with heat it will not release until it is asked to, some hours from now, in the coldest, darkest part of the night. There is the second trough to start now, the one that will need to accommodate the extra flour for tomorrow's christening order, and Tom drags a fresh sack across from the storeroom, feeling the familiar strain settle into his lower back as he tips it against the trough's edge. His hands are already coated to the wrist in a fine, pale film, flour worked so thoroughly into the creases of his knuckles that it will still be faintly visible tomorrow afternoon, no matter how carefully he scrubs before climbing the stairs to sleep. This is simply what his hands look like now, 3 years into the trade, and he no longer thinks to notice it any more than he notices the ache that has become his shoulder's permanent condition. This is one of those moments where the small detail tells a bigger story, and the detail in question is the leaven Tom just folded into tonight's dough. That small living inheritance passed forward from batch to batch. It is worth stepping back from the cellar for a while and asking a larger question. Why did bread, of all things, come to be made this way, by hand, at night, under conditions this punishing? In a city as advanced and as wealthy as London had become by 1861, it is tempting, hearing about conditions this harsh, to assume some single villain must be responsible. A cruel master somewhere deciding, out of simple greed, to work his boys half to death. The truth is both less satisfying and, in its own way, more troubling than that. The answer has almost everything to do with money, and with a very old argument about who gets to control the price of a loaf. For centuries before Tom was ever born, the price and weight of bread in London had not been left to the ordinary forces of a market the way the price of, say, a hat or a chair might be. It was fixed by law, under a regulation known as the assize of bread, which tied the legal weight of a loaf directly to the current price of wheat and flour, adjusted regularly by local magistrates. A baker who sold underweight bread under this system could be fined, publicly shamed, or in earlier centuries subjected to severe punishment. The idea behind it was simple and, in its way, humane. Bread was too essential to leave entirely to a baker's own judgment about profit. The city needed to know that a loaf was a loaf, that its weight could be trusted, because an underfed population was a dangerous population, prone to riot when bread grew scarce or dear. But the assize also had the effect of protecting bakers from the worst extremes of competition, since prices moved together across the trade rather than being fought over shop by shop. That old system had been formally abolished in London in the early years of this century, and by the time Tom is standing in Hollis's cellar in 1861, the price of a loaf has been left, for several decades now, to the ordinary and considerably less forgiving pressures of an open market. The numbers are worth pausing over here, because they explain a great deal about why a shop like Hollis's runs the way it does. A quartern loaf, the standard £4 loaf that most working households bought, costs somewhere in the neighbourhood of 7p in an ordinary week, though that figure could climb noticeably higher when a poor harvest pushed up the price of wheat, or drop when a good one brought it down. A journeyman baker's wage, meanwhile, tended to sit somewhere between 18 shillings and £1 a week, depending on the shop and the city, which meant a man like Walter was spending a real and noticeable fraction of his own earnings simply feeding himself and whatever family he had on the very product he spent his nights producing for other people. It is worth sitting with what a week of that wage actually bought. Rent for 2 rooms, 4 or 5 shillings. Bread for a family of 4 or 5, taking a loaf every day or two at 7p apiece, could easily run to 3 shillings across a week, sometimes more if the harvest had been poor and the price climbed. Coal for the household fire, a little tea, a little sugar, boots that wanted mending more often than any family could comfortably afford, and whatever remained, which was often very little, had to stretch across everything else a household needed. A single bad week, an illness, a period without work could tip a family that looked perfectly respectable on an ordinary Sunday into real difficulty within a fortnight. This is the arithmetic sitting underneath every transaction that crosses the counter above Tom's cellar, and it is the same arithmetic that makes the price of a single loaf, 7p or 8p or 9p, feel like a matter of real consequence to the people buying it, rather than the small, forgettable sum it might seem today. For Tom, none of these figures touch his own pocket directly, since an apprentice earns no wage at all, only his keep. But the economics of the shop shape his life all the same, because Mr. Hollis's entire livelihood depends on selling bread at a price the neighborhood can afford, in a trade with very thin margins and very fierce local competition. There are, by some estimates, well over 2,000 bakeries operating across London at this time, most of them small, family-run concerns exactly like this one, each competing for the same limited number of customers within an easy walk of home. A shop that charged noticeably more than its neighbours for the same loaf would simply lose its trade to the shop next door, which meant every saving mattered, every economy of flour and fuel, and, unavoidably, every economy of labour. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told alongside the comforting image of the corner bakery. That fierce, thin-margin competition created a genuine and well-documented temptation toward cutting corners in ways that went beyond simply working an apprentice hard through the night. Inferior flour, bulked out with substances that had no business in bread at all. Alum, especially, used to whiten a loaf made from cheaper, greyer flour, so it would pass at a glance for the finer white bread that fetched a better price, was a real and recurring problem across the trade in these decades, one serious enough that it had already drawn the attention of chemists and, before long, would draw the attention of Parliament as well. We will return to this a little later in the evening, because it connects to something that was just beginning to change in Tom's world, but for now it is enough to understand the pressure sitting underneath every decision Mr. Hollis makes about what flour to buy and what price to charge. There is a further wrinkle worth naming, since it explains why a shop like Hollis's cannot simply decide, on principle, to pay its journeymen more or work its apprentices less. With something on the order of 2,000 separate bakeries scattered across London, most of them small enough to be run by a single family with perhaps one journeyman and one apprentice, no individual shop had any real power to set its own terms apart from its neighbours. Raise your prices a halfpenny above the shop 2 streets over, and custom drifts quietly away toward the cheaper loaf. Pay your journeyman a shilling more a week than the trade generally allows, and your own margin, already thin, narrows further still. It was a trade in which almost every master, whatever his personal decency, found himself operating inside constraints he had very little individual power to change. A pattern worth remembering the next time a piece of history tempts you to sort its people simply into villains and victims. There is also the matter of what an apprenticeship like Tom's actually costs, and to whom. In many trades, a family wanting to place a son with a respectable master would pay a premium for the privilege, sometimes a substantial one, in exchange for training, food, lodging, and the eventual right to call the boy a skilled tradesman. Baking premiums tended to run lower than trades like watchmaking or engraving, since baking offered less social polish and rather more back-breaking labour. But Tom's father, a carter by trade with more children than spare income, still had to scrape together a modest sum to place him with Hollis 3 years ago. A sum that represented, for that family, several months of careful saving. It was, in its own way, an investment made on the calculation that 7 hard years now would purchase Tom a trade, a skill, and eventually a wage of his own, rather than a lifetime of the same uncertain day labour his father has always known. Whether that calculation proves correct depends, in no small part, on Tom's body holding up long enough to collect on it, which is a subject we will return to before the night is over. because the physical toll of this trade on the men who practice it for decades is neither small nor especially secret. Even if it rarely makes its way into anyone's mental picture of the friendly corner baker. There is more to understand here than a single evening allows, and we will come back to the economics of this trade again before we finish. Because the numbers keep pointing toward the same uncomfortable truth. A city this size, wanting its bread cheap, fresh, and available at a fixed early hour every single morning, was quietly relying on an enormous quantity of unrecorded, undercompensated, and physically brutal nighttime labor to make that convenience possible, and very few of the people enjoying their morning toast ever had reason to think about where the convenience actually came from. It is worth adding one further wrinkle to this picture before we return downstairs, because it explains something about why a trade this hard on the body persisted for as long as it did without more forceful reform. Bread, unlike almost any other commodity a working household purchased, could not simply be stockpiled or bought less frequently to save money, since it grew stale within a day or two and mouldy within a week, especially in the damp of an English winter. This meant demand for fresh baking never slackened, never took a holiday, never gave a trade already stretched thin by competition any real opportunity to slow down and reorganize itself around gentler hours. The same daily urgency that made bread so essential to a working family's survival also made the labor producing it almost impossible to reform from within the trade alone. Real change, when it eventually came, would have to be imposed from outside the ordinary pressures of supply and demand, through exactly the kind of organized petitioning and eventual legislation we will look at more closely before the night is through. For now, though, let us return to the cellar on Turnmill Street, where the dough has had its hour to rise, and where the night's work is only beginning to gather speed. It is a little past 1 in the morning, and the cellar on Turnmill Street has become a different room entirely from the one Tom walked into 2 hours ago. The oven, fed steadily through the evening, now radiates a heat that fills the entire low space, pressing against the skin from 10 feet away the way a held hand feels near a candle flame. Tom has long since stripped down to his shirt, sleeves still rolled, the fabric clinging damp against his back and chest despite the January chill that continues to seep faintly down the stone steps from the street above. Walter has done the same. Even Mr. Hollis, who came down 20 minutes ago to check the fire's progress, took off his coat almost as soon as he reached the bottom step, hanging it on a nail by the storeroom door out of long habit. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of the details that most surprises anyone hearing about this trade for the first time. In the depths of an English winter, with frost forming on the cobbles above and Londoners sleeping under every blanket they own, the men working this cellar are sweating through their shirts, sometimes stripped to the waist by the small hours, working in a heat that regularly climbs past 100 degrees near the oven mouth. Cold and heat exist in this one room, only a few feet and a few minutes apart from each other, which is precisely the kind of contrast that leaves a mark on a body over the years. The constant shifting between scorching proximity to the brick and the raw chill of the stairwell whenever someone needs to fetch more coal or check the street. There is a distinct kind of tiredness that settles into a body around this hour of the night, different from ordinary end-of-day fatigue, since it arrives without the accompanying relief of knowing rest is close at hand. Tom has learned to recognize it as a kind of heaviness behind the eyes more than in the limbs themselves. A fog that thickens gradually rather than announcing itself all at once. And he has learned, too, the handful of small tricks that keep it manageable, splashing cold water from the barrel against his face and neck, stepping briefly toward the stairwell to pull a lungful of the sharper, colder air that still lingers there, timing these small recoveries to the natural pauses the work itself provides rather than stopping deliberately. Since stopping deliberately is a luxury this trade rarely allows. Tom's second batch of dough is ready for its final working. He plunges his hands back into the trough, and the motion by now has become almost automatic, a rhythm his shoulders know without needing his mind to direct them. Lean and press and fold. Lean and press and fold, the dough answering back with its own stubborn resistance each time. His arms ache in the specific, familiar way they ache every night around this hour, not sharp, but deep and constant. The kind of ache that settles into muscle rather than announcing itself in any single sharp moment. "Mind the third trough," Walter says, passing behind him with an armful of split wood for the fire. "That one's been proving faster than the others." "Warmer corner of the room, I'd guess." Tom checks it, pressing 2 fingers gently into the surface the way Walter taught him. The dough springs back slowly, holding the faint impression a moment before smoothing itself out again. Close, but not there yet. He covers it again and turns his attention to shaping the first batch, which has finished its rise and is ready to be divided, weighed by eye and then by hand on the small counter scale kept for exactly this purpose, and shaped into the recognizable rounded forms that will become tomorrow's quartern loaves. Shaping is quieter work than kneading, requiring less brute force and more of a careful, practiced touch, folding the dough in on itself repeatedly until the surface pulls taut and smooth, the way a good loaf needs to look before it goes into the oven. It is here, in this quieter stretch of the night, that conversation tends to return, low and unhurried, the two of them working side by side at the shaping table. "You'll want that surface tighter," Mr. Hollis says, watching over Tom's shoulder for a moment before moving off toward the oven again. "Loose skin like that, you'll get a split down the side when it bakes." "Yes, sir, not scolding you, boy, just watch it." It is a small exchange, but it matters to Tom more than he would ever say aloud. Mr. Hollis is not a warm man in any obvious sense, not given to praise or encouragement beyond the occasional grunt of approval, but there is something steady and fair in how he corrects rather than punishes, teaches rather than merely criticizes. Tom has heard enough from other apprentices around the neighborhood, boys placed with harsher masters, cuffed for mistakes that were really just the ordinary clumsiness of learning a difficult trade, to know that this cellar, hot and exhausting as it is, could be a considerably worse place to spend his nights. By 2 in the morning, the first loaves are shaped, covered, and set aside for their final proving, the last rise before baking, and the oven has very nearly reached the heat it needs. Mr. Hollis judges this the old way, by eye and by touch, holding a hand briefly near the oven mouth and reading the exact pale, almost silvery color the brick has taken on, a color that comes only after hours of steady firing, and that experience alone teaches a person to recognize. Too little heat and the bread will bake pale and dense, disappointing in the window tomorrow. Too much and the crust will scorch black before the inside has properly cooked through, ruining the batch entirely, and with it, a portion of the night's wages that Walter, at least, will actually feel in his pocket. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you sit with it. There is no dial to check, no thermometer built into this oven the way a modern kitchen takes utterly for granted. The entire operation rests on the accumulated judgment of a man who has done this exact task perhaps 6,000 times before, reading heat the way a sailor reads a sky, and passing that judgment down, slowly and imperfectly, to a boy who is still, after 3 years, only beginning to trust his own eye over his master's. The fire is raked out now, the last of the embers and ash pulled clear of the oven floor with the long iron rake, swept into the waiting bucket in a fresh cloud of fine grey dust that catches in the thin gaslight and drifts. Slow and glittering before settling on every surface in the room, including the men. Tom coughs once, quietly, a small dry sound he barely registers anymore, the reflexive clearing of a throat that has spent 3 years breathing this air on a nightly basis. Walter does the same a moment later, without comment. It is simply part of the work, the way a blacksmith accepts the ring in his ears or a tanner accepts the smell that never fully leaves his hands. Now comes the moment that requires the most nerve and the most skill of the entire night. The oven floor, freshly swept clean, is scorching, dark, and utterly unforgiving of hesitation. Tom takes up the long wooden peel, its handle worn smooth by years of hands exactly like his, and slides the first shaped loaf onto its flat blade. He steps close to the oven mouth, feeling the heat roll against his face and forearms in a solid wave, and with a single practiced motion, tips the peel forward and slides the loaf deep into the back corner of the chamber, withdrawing the blade in the same fluid movement, leaving the loaf sitting exactly where it needs to sit. It looks, when done well, almost effortless, and that is precisely the danger of it. A moment's hesitation, an angle held a half-second too long, and the peel's long handle can graze the scorching brick above the oven mouth, or worse, deliver its bearer a serious burn along the forearm. An injury common enough in this trade that Walter carries a pale, shining scar along his own left arm from an early year of his own apprenticeship. A mistake he still describes, when pressed, with more embarrassment than pain. Loaf after loaf goes in this way, Tom and Walter working in a rotation that has become, over years of repetition, almost a kind of dance, each of them reading the other's movement well enough to avoid ever colliding in the cramped space before the oven mouth. 20 loaves. 30. The back corners fill first, then the middle, then the front, each loaf placed with care because a batch crowded too closely will bake unevenly. And an uneven batch, again, means wasted flour and wasted wages in a trade that has very little tolerance for waste of any kind. It is nearly 3 in the morning by the time the last loaf of this batch goes in and the heavy iron door swings shut, sealing in the heat, and for a few minutes an unfamiliar kind of quiet settles over the cellar. There is nothing to knead, nothing to shape, nothing to load, only the low, steady presence of the oven working through the brick and the occasional creak of the house settling above. Tom sinks onto an upturned flour sack in the corner, back against the cool stone wall, and allows himself, for the first time in hours, to simply breathe. Mrs. Hollis, roused briefly from sleep by some habit of her own body that Tom has never fully understood, comes partway down the cellar steps with a small pot of weak tea and a heel of yesterday's bread for the two of them. A quiet, wordless kindness she performs most nights around this hour without ever being asked. Tom eats slowly, feeling the warmth of the tea move down through his chest, and for a few minutes, sitting in the mingled heat of the oven and the low murmur of Walter's half-asleep conversation about nothing in particular, this hard, strange, backward life feels, briefly, almost peaceful. Walter, chewing his own heel of bread, tips his head back against the cool brick and closes his eyes, not quite sleeping, but close enough to it that his voice, when it comes, sounds slower than usual. "You still reading that story of yours?" he says. It is not really a question. When there's time for it. There's never time for it. That's rather the point of it, isn't it? Something to look forward to that has nothing to do with any of this. Tom doesn't answer right away, turning the tin cup of tea slowly between his flour-whitened fingers. It is, he thinks, exactly the point of it, though he would not have put it so plainly himself. Walter has a way of naming things simply that Tom, 3 years his junior in the trade, has not yet learnt to manage. It will not last. The next batch is already proving in its trough, and the oven, once its heat begins to fade from this first bake, will need tending again before long. But for these few minutes, in the deep, private hour of the night that belongs to almost no one else in the city above, Tom rests. Before we follow Tom into the second half of his night, there is something worth understanding about what this trade does to a body over the years and about the wider set of rules and expectations that shaped a life like his, because neither of those things ends at the cellar door. Start with the body, since Tom's own body is, at 17, still early enough in this story that the worst of it has not yet arrived, though the signs are already beginning to show themselves if you know where to look. Bakers of this period were widely known, among physicians who took any interest in the health of working trades, to suffer from a distinct and fairly predictable set of ailments. Chief among them was a chronic respiratory condition that people at the time simply called baker's asthma, a persistent tightness and wheeze in the chest brought on by years of breathing air thick with fine flour dust night after night in a poorly ventilated room. It was not a mysterious or rare complaint. It was common enough and consistent enough that observers of London's working trades in these very decades, most notably the journalist Henry Mayhew, who took the trouble to interview working bakers directly about their conditions, described it as one of the defining hazards of the trade, alongside chronic bronchial trouble and a general early wearing down of a man's constitution that left journeyman bakers looking, by their 30s and 40s, considerably older than their years. There was a particular cruelty in how gradually this damage tended to arrive, which perhaps explains why so few bakers spoke of it as a crisis while they were living through it. A man did not wake one morning suddenly unable to breathe properly. He simply noticed, over years, that a flight of stairs left him more winded than it once had, that a certain tightness in the chest had become his ordinary companion rather than an occasional visitor, that his cough, once rare, had become the small, unremarkable sound that opened most of his mornings. By the time a journeyman baker reached his 40s, assuming the trade had not already driven him towards some other, less punishing line of work, that accumulated damage had usually become simply part of who he was, indistinguishable, to himself at least, from ordinary aging. There was more besides the lungs. Standing for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch on a hot brick floor, often in bare feet or thin-worn shoes because proper boots grew unbearable in that heat, left many bakers with swollen veins, aching joints, and a noticeable stoop or bend to the legs that developed slowly, invisibly, over years, the body quietly rearranging itself around the demands placed on it. The heat itself, that steady, punishing radiance from the oven, was blamed by contemporary observers for a kind of premature exhaustion of the whole system, a wearing thin that no amount of food or rest seemed fully able to repair, since the amount of food and rest available to most journeymen was itself never quite sufficient to begin with. There was, alongside all of this, the simple matter of interrupted sleep, which modern medicine has only much later come to understand as a genuine physical harm in its own right, rather than a mere inconvenience. Tom's rest, such as it is, comes in a single unbroken stretch through the middle of the day, roughly from noon until early evening, a pattern that leaves him permanently somewhat out of step with his own body's natural inclinations, since even a body accustomed to sleeping by day never fully abandons its older instinct to wake with the light. Fatigue of this chronic kind, layered on top of the heat and the dust and the physical strain, was simply the ordinary condition of a working baker's life, so constant and so universal within the trade that it rarely earned any special mention at all. Now here is where most people get this wrong, imagining that a trade producing something as wholesome and life-sustaining as bread must have been, in some rough sense, a healthy trade, an honest outdoor sort of labour close to the good raw materials of life. The opposite was closer to the truth. The men and boys who made London's bread were, as a group, among the more sickly of the city's skilled trades, worn down by heat, dust, irregular sleep, and the peculiar isolation of a working life spent almost entirely at night, cut off from daylight, from regular meals eaten at regular hours, from the ordinary rhythms of family life that even other hard trades still allowed their workers to keep. There is more to understand here, because the rules governing a life like Tom's extended well beyond the physical. There was also the matter of education, or rather, its general absence from a life shaped this thoroughly around night labour. Tom had a few years of basic schooling before his apprenticeship began, enough to read haltingly and puzzle out simple sums. But formal instruction of any kind essentially ended the moment his indenture did, replaced entirely by the practical education of the trade itself, learned hand to hand from Walter and Mr. Hollis rather than from any book or teacher. This was not unusual for a boy of his class and circumstance. It simply meant that whatever curiosity a boy like Tom carried, and Tom carries a fair amount of it, judging by that well-thumbed penny story tucked behind its loose brick, had to be satisfied on his own time, in his own snatched minutes, rather than through anything resembling formal instruction. His indenture was not simply a private understanding between his father and Mr. Hollis. It was a legal document, enforceable in the courts, and it bound Tom every bit as firmly as it bound his master. An apprentice who ran from his indenture before his term was served could, in principle, be pursued, and if found, compelled by a magistrate to return and complete his service, since the law regarded the arrangement as a genuine contract deserving genuine enforcement, whatever hardship the apprentice himself might feel about it on any given exhausting night. In practice, plenty of apprentices did run, especially from harsher masters than Hollis, and plenty of those runaways were never seriously pursued, since chasing down a single miserable boy cost a master more in time and trouble than it was usually worth. But the law stood behind the arrangement all the same, a quiet, unspoken pressure sitting underneath every hard night Tom spends in this cellar, a reminder that his labour here is not simply expected of him. It is, in a real legal sense, owed. Religion, too, shaped this life in ways that might surprise a modern listener. Sunday was, in principle, a day of rest across most of London, church bells calling the city to worship and most ordinary trades falling quiet out of both custom and law. Bread, however, does not observe the Sabbath any more patiently than it observes the clock, and a great many London bakeries, Hollis's among them, still fired their ovens and baked at least a partial batch through Saturday night into Sunday morning, since a household attending church still expected its usual loaf waiting at home afterward. This was, in these very years, becoming a genuine point of public argument. A growing number of reform-minded clergy and, notably, the bakers themselves, organizing through their own trade societies, had begun campaigning rather forcefully against Sunday baking and against night work generally, arguing that no trade, however essential its product, ought to cost a working man every single ounce of rest and worship the rest of society still managed to preserve for itself. We will return to that campaign a little later tonight, because it was, in Tom's own year, gathering real momentum, though its fullest victories were still to come. Class showed itself too in the smaller daily courtesies that a boy like Tom learned to navigate almost without thinking. He addressed Mr. Hollis as Sir, always, and Mrs. Hollis as Ma'am, while Walter, senior to him in the trade but still a working man rather than a master, received a familiarity closer to what an older brother might expect. Customers at the counter above, whatever their own modest means, occupied a rung above the men who fed them, and Tom understood, the way children of his class generally understood such things without needing to be told directly, exactly how far a nod or a good morning was expected to go in either direction. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told alongside the friendly image of the corner bakery. The social position of a man like Walter, a paid journeyman, or a boy like Tom, an unpaid apprentice, sat well below that of the shopkeepers and clerks who bought their bread each morning, despite the fact that their labour was, in the most literal sense, feeding the entire neighbourhood. A journeyman baker occupied a curious rung on the London ladder, skilled enough to command respect within his own trade, yet poor enough, and worked hard enough, that he rarely mixed socially with the more comfortable tradesmen a few streets over, the tailors and jewellers of Clerkenwell, who kept more humane hours and cleaner hands. Bread was essential. The men who made it were, in the eyes of most of the city consuming their loaves every morning, almost entirely invisible, a fact that will matter a great deal when we come, later tonight, to the patterns running underneath this whole story. None of this is offered to suggest Tom's life was without its own compensations, because it was not, and a story that only ever counted its grievances would be as dishonest, in its own way, as one that only ever counted its comforts. There was real pride in a skill mastered, real companionship in the easy, unglamorous back and forth between himself and Walter, a genuine decency in a master who corrected rather than merely punished. What we are doing tonight is simply refusing to let the comfortable half of the picture stand in for the whole of it, which is, in the end, all history worth telling ever really asks of us. For now, though, 3 in the morning is drawing on toward 4, and Tom's brief rest on the flour sack cannot last forever. The second batch is proving faster than expected in the trough's warm corner, and somewhere above the quiet cellar, the first faint stirrings of a city that never entirely sleeps are already beginning. A distant cartwheel on cobblestones, a dog barking twice and falling silent, the long night moving, however slowly, toward its answer. It is 4 in the morning, and the night has entered the stretch that Walter always calls the longest hour, though it is never actually only 1 hour long. There is a rhythm to how a bakehouse like this one moves through its busiest stretch, and it rewards a moment's attention, since the pattern repeats itself, with small variations across nearly every working bakery in London tonight. Fire, then flour, then the long labour of kneading, then the patient wait while the dough decides, on its own unhurried schedule, whether it has risen enough to bake, then the careful, dangerous work at the oven mouth, then the wait again while the brick does the rest. Each stage depends entirely on the one before it, and none of them can be rushed without ruining the batch, which means the whole night unfolds according to a logic that has almost nothing to do with the clock on the wall and everything to do with yeast, heat, and the practiced judgment of the people tending both. The first batch has come out of the oven some time ago, and now sits cooling on wooden racks along the back wall, filling the cellar with a smell entirely different from the raw, dusty smell of flour that dominated the earlier part of the night. This is the smell the whole story has been circling since the moment we came down these stairs, warm, faintly sweet, deeply comforting, the smell that will, in a few hours, drift up through the street grate and reach the noses of people walking past who have no notion at all of what produced it. Down here, standing close to racks of bread, not yet an hour out of the oven, Tom still finds something in that smell that catches at him even after 3 years. A small, private satisfaction that survives the exhaustion surrounding it. There is no time to admire it for long. The oven has been raked, refired, and brought back up to heat twice already tonight, since a single firing rarely produces enough bread to supply the whole of tomorrow's trade, and the second and third batches are already shaped, proved, and ready for their turn in the chamber. Tom and Walter fall back into the same rotation at the oven mouth. Peel and loaf. Peel and loaf, the motion so practiced by this hour of the night that Tom's mind has drifted somewhere else entirely, moving through the plot of his penny adventure story, half-formed and interrupted, while his hands continue their work without needing him. It is around 4:30 that the near mishap happens, small in the end, but sharp enough to snap Tom fully back into the present. Reaching to adjust a loaf that has slid slightly off its intended spot near the back of the chamber, he lets the peel's handle drift a fraction too close to the brick arch above the oven mouth, and the wood catches, just barely, against heat fierce enough that he feels it instantly through his sleeve, a hot line across his forearm that will leave a faint pink mark by morning, though nothing worse. He pulls back sharply, more startled than hurt, and Walter glances over without slowing his own rhythm. "Careful with that arm," Walter says. "I've got a scar exactly like the one you nearly gave yourself, and I didn't need the company." "I'm fine." "Didn't say you weren't. Said be careful." It passes in seconds, barely worth mentioning except for what it reveals. This is a trade in which a moment's lapse in concentration after 5 straight hours of hard, repetitive, exhausting labor carries a real physical cost, and the fact that serious burns and worse were common enough across the trade to be considered simply part of the job, rather than a shocking exception, tells you something about how thoroughly this kind of risk had been absorbed into the ordinary texture of a baker's working life. No one down here treats it as remarkable. It is simply the shape the night takes. By 5, the sky above the street, invisible from down here but announced by a very faint change in the quality of light through the useless little great window, has begun its slow shift from black toward the deep blue-grey that comes before an English winter dawn. The city above is stirring in earnest now. Carters are already moving through nearby streets, market traffic bound for Smithfield rumbling somewhere in the near distance, and the household above the shop has begun its own quieter waking. Footsteps crossing the ceiling boards, the faint cry of the youngest Hollis child briefly protesting the cold of getting out of bed. There is a distinct quality to the light by now, still thin and grey through the useless little grate, but noticeably less black than it was an hour ago, and Tom finds himself, as he does most mornings around this hour, briefly disoriented by it, his whole sense of the day's shape built around darkness rather than light, so that this pale, ordinary morning brightness feels almost like an intrusion into a world that has, for the last 6 hours, belonged entirely to fire and gaslight. Mrs. Hollis comes down properly now, dressed for the day, to help assess how many loaves are ready and how the morning's deliveries ought to be organized, since Hollis's supplies not only its own shopfront but a small standing arrangement with 2 nearby coffee houses and a boarding establishment a few streets over, all of them expecting their bread at a reliable early hour. She counts loaves with quick, practiced eyes, murmuring numbers to herself, and disappears back up the stairs to begin opening the shutters and preparing the counter for the day's first customers. The final batch goes into the oven around 5:30, the very last of the night's dough, and it is this batch, timed with real precision, that will come out crusty and only just cooled enough to handle right as the earliest customers begin arriving above. Getting that timing correct so that the bread is fresh without being so hot it cannot be properly wrapped and carried is itself a small, unglamorous skill that Mr. Hollis has spent decades refining, and one Tom is only beginning to feel confident predicting on his own. There is a correction worth making plainly here, because it sits at the very center of tonight's whole story. The word freshness, as any advertisement or fond memory might use it, suggests something effortless, almost accidental, bread simply appearing warm because that is what bread does. What freshness actually required, in London in 1861, was a night's worth of precisely sequenced human labour, timed backward from a fixed hour of demand with almost mechanical exactness, performed by people who themselves would not taste a proper night's sleep for another several hours yet. The customer's convenience and the baker's exhaustion were, in the most direct sense possible, the very same transaction, simply viewed from opposite ends of the counter. By 6, the first grey light has properly arrived, visible now even through the poor little grate, and the sounds from the street above have thickened from scattered footsteps into something closer to a steady current. Boots and cartwheels, and the calls of early vendors setting up elsewhere in the neighbourhood. Tom carries the last of the finished loaves up the cellar steps in a wide flat basket balanced against his hip, blinking hard as he emerges briefly into the shop's back room, where actual daylight, thin and colourless as it is this early on a January morning, still strikes his eyes after 5 hours spent entirely by gaslight and firelight below. Mrs. Hollis is already at the counter, sleeves rolled, arranging the morning's stock with the same brisk efficiency she brings to everything. Through the front window, Tom can see 2 figures already waiting on the pavement outside, well before the shop's proper opening hour, regulars who know that the first loaves of the day, still faintly warm, are worth arriving early for. One of them is Mrs. Atwood, a widow from 2 streets over who has bought her bread from this shop for as long as Tom has worked here, and who always asks, out of what seems like genuine habit rather than mere politeness, whether the boy is keeping well. Tom likes her for it, in a small, uncomplicated way, since so few people who buy the bread ever think to ask after the hands that made it. "Cold enough for you this morning, Tom," she says, as Mrs. Hollis unlocks the door and the bell above it gives its bright, ordinary ring. "Cold enough," Mrs. Atwood, he says, and means it, though the cold outside is nothing at all next to what the last 6 hours have asked of him. Nearly there, Mrs. Hollis says, not looking up from her arranging. Go on and get the delivery basket ready for the coffeehouse order. Walter can manage the last of the oven. Tom nods and turns back toward the cellar steps, catching, just for a moment, the strange doubled sensation of standing at the exact seam between two entirely different worlds. The bright, ordinary shop about to open its doors to a city that has no idea what the last 7 hours actually contained. And the hot, dim, exhausted cellar below, where the true labor of this whole morning has been quietly, invisibly accomplished. There is a second delivery still to make after the coffee house. A standing order for the boarding house on the next street, and Tom will make that run himself as well, since Walter is needed below to see the last of the ovens properly emptied and the cellar set in some order before the two of them are finally released for the day. 2 deliveries, 4 streets each way, a basket that grows lighter with every stop. This is Tom's regular closing task most mornings. The last physical demand a night that began nearly 7 hours earlier will make of him before he is finally free to climb those narrow stairs and sleep. He carries the delivery basket out through the side door a few minutes later into a street that is fully grey now, cold air startling against a face and neck still flushed from oven heat, and makes his way the 4 streets over to the coffee house that expects its order by 6:30 without fail. It is a short walk, ordinary in every visible respect, a boy with a basket of bread moving through a waking London street. No one he passes has any particular reason to look at him twice. He passes the coffee house's own porter setting out chairs on the pavement as he approaches, and passes, a little further on, a crossing sweeper already at work, clearing a path through the night's accumulated mud and horse dung for the better-dressed pedestrians who will want their boots kept clean on the way to their offices. The city is filling in around him with all its ordinary daytime population now, clerks and errand boys and shopkeepers unlocking their own doors, none of them sparing a second glance for a baker's apprentice with a basket, since a boy delivering bread is one of the most unremarkable sights a London street can offer at this hour. And that, more than anything else tonight, is the quiet, uncomfortable center of this whole story. The labor that fed this entire corner of London, the heat endured, the dough forced into shape by aching shoulders, the flour breathed in hour after hour until it coated the back of a young throat, passes completely without notice, dressed in nothing more remarkable than a boy walking down an ordinary street with an ordinary basket, on an ordinary morning in a city that will eat well today without ever once wondering how. In 1848, a small group of London journeyman bakers founded a trade society with a single, stubborn demand at its center: an end to night work. There is a certain satisfaction and a certain sadness in knowing slightly more about a person's future than the person themselves could ever have known standing inside their own present moment. It is worth stopping here, on this ordinary January morning, while Tom's basket is still warm against his hip, to look at what was actually shifting underneath a trade that must have felt, to the men living inside it, almost eternal, as fixed and unchangeable as the weather. It was not eternal. It was already, quietly and unevenly, beginning to come apart, and Tom, at 17, is standing closer to the end of this way of making bread than he could possibly know. The society founded in 1848 called itself the Friendly Society of Operative Bakers, and its central grievance was exactly the labor we have spent this whole night watching: the 11 o'clock start, the 14 or more hours of continuous work, the sleep taken in scraps, the Sunday baking that stole the one day the rest of the city still kept for itself. These were not new complaints. Journeymen had grumbled about night work for generations. What made the 1840s and 1850s different was organization, men across many separate small shops, finding a shared voice and a shared strategy, petitioning Parliament, publishing pamphlets, and slowly building the kind of sustained public pressure that individual complaint had never managed to achieve. Progress was slow and deeply frustrating to the men pushing for it. But it was progress, and by the time we reach 1863, only 2 years past the night we are spending with Tom, Parliament will pass an act aimed specifically at restricting night baking for younger workers. An imperfect law, unevenly enforced, full of loopholes a determined master could still slip through. But a first legislative acknowledgement, all the same, that a boy Tom's age perhaps ought not to spend every night of his youth in a suffocating cellar. The campaign these men waged was not a dramatic one, at least not in the way a modern reader might expect drama to look. There were no marches through the centre of London, no headline confrontations. There were petitions, carefully worded and repeatedly submitted. There were meetings held in back rooms of public houses after exhausting night shifts, attended by men who could have simply gone home to sleep instead and chose, tired as they were, to spend an hour arguing over the wording of a resolution. There were newspaper letters, some published, many not, describing the ordinary facts of a working night much like the one we have just spent with Tom, offered up as evidence that something in this trade needed to change. Progress of this kind rarely announces itself. It accumulates, quietly, through years of unglamorous, exhausting persistence carried forward by people who mostly never lived to see whether their effort had actually mattered. Tom does not know this is coming. Standing in his cellar tonight, the 11 o'clock start feels as permanent to him as the brick oven itself. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you know it. Because it means we, sitting comfortably in a much later century, can see something about Tom's own moment that Tom himself cannot. The fact that the world he has been bound into by a 7-year indenture is already, at its edges, beginning to loosen, even if the change will arrive too late and too incompletely to spare him personally from most of what remains of his own apprenticeship. There is a second, related current moving through this trade in these very years, and it concerns what actually goes into the bread itself. We touched on it earlier, the temptation toward cutting corners in a fiercely competitive, thin-margin trade. Alum used to whiten inferior flour chief among the abuses. What had, for decades, been a matter of scattered suspicion and occasional prosecution became, in the early 1850s, something considerably harder to ignore, thanks largely to the painstaking work of a physician named Arthur Hill Hassell, who conducted a systematic chemical analysis of food sold across London, bread included, publishing his findings in a series of reports that received wide and uncomfortable attention. Hassell's analyses confirmed what many had long suspected and few had been able to prove with any rigor, that a meaningful portion of the bread sold across the city carried additives that had no honest place in it. The public reaction, once real evidence rather than mere rumour was placed in front of it, was substantial enough to help push Parliament toward passing legislation aimed at food adulteration more broadly by the end of that decade. It is worth being precise about what Hassell actually found, since precision is exactly what the scandal turned on. His analyses showed alum present in a genuinely troubling share of the ordinary white bread sold across London, added chiefly to make bread baked from cheaper, greyer flour appear as fine and white as the more expensive loaf a wealthier household expected. It was not, in most cases, a poison added with malicious intent, but rather a cosmetic shortcut taken by bakers competing desperately on appearance in a trade that offered them almost no other way to distinguish their loaf from the one sold 2 doors down. That distinction, cosmetic rather than murderous, did nothing to soften the public's reaction once the practice was laid out plainly in print. And rightly so, since a customer paying for the appearance of quality has every reason to expect the substance of it as well. For Mr. Hollis, running an honest if unglamorous shop on Turnmill Street, none of this scandal touches his own flour bins directly, since he has always bought from a supplier he trusts and has never seen the sense in whitening a loaf that customers along this street have never demanded look whiter than it naturally is. But the scandal touches him all the same. In the slightly harder eye his regular customers now turn toward every baker's shop in London, a new, wary awareness that the bread on the counter might not always be quite what it claims to be. Trust, once a simple, unexamined feature of buying your morning loaf from a shop you had known your whole life, has become, in these very years, something that has to be actively earned and occasionally proven. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told alongside the eventual legislative fixes and eventual protective laws. Change of this kind almost never arrives as a single decisive moment. It arrives slowly, unevenly, contested every step of the way by masters worried about cost and profit, celebrated too early by reformers who then discover how weakly a new law is actually enforced, felt differently by every individual worker depending on the exact shop, the exact master, the exact city they happen to labor in. Tom's own children, should he have them one day, will very likely bake bread under conditions meaningfully different from his own, shorter nights, cleaner regulation, perhaps even, within their own lifetimes, the arrival of a genuine mechanical dough mixer that will finally lift some portion of this brutal manual labor off human shoulders entirely. But Tom himself, tonight, in 1861, still belongs almost entirely to the older world. The world of hand-kneaded dough and wood and coal-fired ovens, and a night that answers only to the patient, unhurried clock of fermenting yeast. It is worth pausing, too, on how these two threads, the campaign against night work and the scandal over adulteration, actually reinforced one another in the public mind, even though they concerned quite different problems. Both pointed toward the same underlying suspicion that the trade producing London's single most essential foodstuff had, through decades of unregulated competition, drifted somewhere it should never have been allowed to drift, whether that meant a boy Tom's age losing his youth to a nightly furnace, or a housewife unknowingly feeding her family bread whitened with a substance that had no business in it. Reform movements of this era rarely progressed on a single front. They tended to gather strength precisely when several separate grievances, examined together, painted the same uncomfortable picture from multiple angles at once. There is one more thread worth naming before we return to him, because it points most directly toward the future waiting just past this January morning. In the very next year, 1862, a new company will open its first shop not far from here, calling itself the Aerated Bread Company, selling loaves made by an entirely different method. One that uses carbonic acid gas rather than yeast to raise the dough, mixed and worked by machine rather than by human arms, requiring no lengthy fermentation, no overnight proving, no small army of exhausted boys kneading through the small hours in a suffocating cellar. It will not replace shops like Hollis's overnight, or even within Tom's own working lifetime. Old trades rarely vanish the moment a new method appears, and plenty of Londoners will keep preferring the taste and the tradition of properly leavened bread for generations yet. But the arrival of that first mechanized bakery is, in its own quiet way, the sound of a door beginning to open onto everything that will eventually change about this trade, a door Tom cannot see from where he stands tonight, though we, looking back from so much further down the road, can see it rather clearly. For now, though, let us step back into that January morning, because Tom's basket is empty, the coffee house order delivered, and there is still the matter of getting through the rest of this day. Let us step back now from the hours of this morning and look at the whole shape of the day we have just spent with Tom, because a single life, followed closely enough, tends to reveal patterns that no textbook summary ever quite manages to capture. The first pattern is the sheer invisibility of the labor itself. Everything Tom did tonight, every sack of flour dragged and dumped, every hour spent leaning his whole body weight into a trough of resisting dough, every burn risked at the mouth of a scorching oven, happened entirely out of sight of the people it served. The customer standing at the counter this morning, admiring a warm loaf, will never see the cellar, never smell the flour dust thick enough to taste, never know the boy's name who shaped the very bread now warming her hands through its paper wrapping. This is not a cruelty anyone intended. It is simply how cities of this size organize themselves, sorting labor into rooms the customer never has to enter so that the finished product can arrive looking effortless, as though warmth and freshness were simply properties of bread itself rather than the accumulated result of someone else's exhausting night. We will meet this pattern again and again if we look closely at almost any comfort a city offers its people. Someone, somewhere, usually out of sight, is awake, so that someone else does not have to think about it. It is worth noticing, before we go further, how thoroughly these patterns interlock rather than standing apart from one another as separate observations. The invisibility of Tom's labor is not incidental to the trade's economics. It is, in a real sense, what makes those economics survivable for a household budget already stretched thin by the price of a loaf. A customer paying 7p for her bread has very little appetite, whatever her private sympathies, for knowing the full human cost behind that price, since knowing it clearly would make the ordinary necessary act of feeding her family feel considerably heavier than it currently does. Comfort, in other words, is not merely a byproduct of hidden labor. It depends on that labor staying hidden. The second pattern is the way this life ran entirely against the grain of the city surrounding it. Tom's whole existence was organized around an inverted clock, his evening beginning when other households were banking their fires, his rest arriving well after the rest of Turnmill Street had already eaten breakfast and gone to work. This borrowed, backward rhythm cut him off from an enormous amount of ordinary social life, from daylight itself for long stretches, from the shared rituals of family meals and evening company that even other hard, poorly paid trades in this period still generally preserved. There is something quietly significant in the fact that the trades most essential to keeping a city fed and functioning are so often the ones asked to live furthest outside its normal rhythm, invisible not only in space but in time as well. The third pattern concerns the body as the actual instrument of production. We spent real time tonight on the physical mechanics of kneading, on the sheer muscular force required to turn flour and water into workable dough without any machine to assist. And it is worth naming plainly what that means. In 1861, before mechanization had reached this trade in any meaningful way, a baker's own arms, shoulders, and back were the only tools capable of doing this essential work, and those tools wore down exactly the way any hard-used instrument does. Through chronic ailments, through the respiratory trouble we discussed, through the slow bending and aching that Mayhew and other observers of the period documented so consistently among working bakers. The city's bread depended, in the most literal sense, on human bodies being spent in its service, a fact easy to overlook when the finished loaf sits so cleanly and pleasantly in a shop window. The fourth pattern is the peculiar gap between essential and honored. Bread was, as we discussed earlier tonight, the single most essential foodstuff in a working Londoner's budget, more fundamental to daily survival than meat, than coal, arguably than rent itself in the worst weeks, and yet the men who produced it occupied one of the humbler rungs on the city's social ladder, poorly paid relative to their hours, physically marked by their trade in ways that other tradesmen were not, rarely thanked directly by the customers whose whole day depended on their labor. Essential and honored, it turns out, are not at all the same quality, and this gap between them shows up again and again across almost every century of human labor, not only this one. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the quietest one, is the sheer patience this trade demanded. Patience with fire that could not be rushed. Patience with yeast that answered to its own slow biology and no one else's schedule. Patience with a body that ached whether or not the ache was acknowledged. Tom's whole night was an exercise in accepting timelines he did not control. The oven's heat building at its own pace, the dough rising at its own pace, the customer's expectation of a warm loaf by a fixed hour dictating everything else, regardless of how tired his arms happened to be by 3 a.m. There is something almost meditative in this kind of forced patience, even inside genuinely brutal working conditions, a discipline of attention that a boy like Tom absorbed simply by surviving inside it long enough. There is a sixth pattern worth naming as well, quieter than the rest, but present in nearly every hour we spent with Tom tonight, and it concerns the small private world a person builds for himself inside even the most demanding circumstances. Tom's penny adventure story, tucked behind its loose brick, cost him almost nothing and occupied almost none of his time. And yet it mattered enormously, precisely because it belonged entirely to him, chosen freely in a life where very little else was. Walter's easy teasing, the quiet decency of Mr. Hollis's corrections, Mrs. Hollis's wordless kindness with a pot of tea at 3 a.m. None of these things appear in any account of wages or working hours, and yet they are, in their own modest way, exactly what made a genuinely hard life a livable one. History has a habit of measuring lives by their hardships, since hardships tend to leave the clearest records behind. It is worth remembering that the people living those lives were measuring them, at least in part, by their small, private comforts instead. A seventh pattern, and perhaps the one that reaches furthest beyond this cellar, is how thoroughly a life like Tom's depended on other people's willingness not to look too closely. The customer at the counter, the family expecting their christening loaves, the coffee house waiting on its regular order, none of them were unkind people. And none of them would likely have wished this arrangement of suffering on anyone had it been placed plainly in front of them. But comfort of this kind survives, in almost every century, by remaining slightly out of view, tucked below a shop front, behind a closed door, down a flight of stone steps that most people who benefit from what happens down there will never have any reason to descend. Seeing clearly, which is what we have tried to do together tonight, is a small act. But it is not nothing. None of these patterns belong only to a cellar on Turnmill Street, or only to the trade of baking, or even only to the 19th century. Walk through almost any comfortable, well-ordered corner of any city in almost any era, and you will find, if you look for it the way we have looked tonight, some version of this same arrangement humming quietly underneath, labor kept carefully out of sight, a body absorbing a cost that the finished product never shows, a rhythm of work bent entirely around someone else's convenience. Tom's story is specific, and we have tried to honor that specificity rather than flatten it into a generic lesson. But it is also, in this sense, a door, and once you have walked through one door like it, you tend to notice the outline of a great many similar doors elsewhere, in centuries closer to your own than this one. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one apprentice's difficult trade. They describe a whole hidden architecture running underneath the comfortable surface of a 19th century city. An architecture built from countless individual nights exactly like this one, each nearly invisible on its own, each essential in aggregate, each carrying its own quiet cost paid by people the rest of the city rarely paused to consider. Tom will grow older inside this architecture. Some of it will loosen around him, as we have seen, the slow work of trade societies and reformers and, eventually, machines beginning to lift certain burdens from certain shoulders. Much of it will remain largely unchanged for a long while yet. But for one single night, in one cellar on one London street, we have been allowed to see the whole shape of it clearly, which is, perhaps, the quiet purpose of spending an evening like this one together at all. It is nearly noon by the time Tom finally lies down. The morning has run its full course by then, the shop trading steadily since 7, the coffee house and boarding house deliveries long since completed, the last of the cellar cleaned and swept in preparation for tomorrow night's fire. Mr. Hollis has gone up to eat a proper meal and rest a few hours himself before the shop's afternoon business picks up. Walter has gone home to his own lodgings a few streets away, to whatever remains of his own day before the whole cycle begins again for him tonight. And Tom, who sleeps here in the household rather than returning anywhere else, climbs a narrow back stair to the small room he shares with no one, tucked under the eaves above the Hollis family's own bedrooms, and pulls the curtain across the single window against the thin, indifferent daylight outside. Downstairs, faintly, Anne Hollis moves between the counter and the back room, tallying the morning's takings, and one of the children, the younger one, can be heard asking some question that gets a distracted, gentle answer rather than a full one. Mr. Hollis rests now in the larger bedroom at the front of the house, where the noise of the street will wake him again well before Tom stirs. The house is quiet in the particular way a house becomes quiet only after a long stretch of motion finally stops. Below, faintly, Tom can hear the muffled bell of the shop door opening and closing as customers come and go. And under that, fainter still, the ordinary creak and settle of old timber that every house makes once the people inside it have stopped moving through it. Somewhere outside, a cart passes. A dog barks once and is answered by another, farther off. And then nothing. Outside, the street has settled into its ordinary midday business. Carts and voices and the occasional ring of the shop bell below carrying faintly up through the floorboards, none of it loud enough to trouble a body this thoroughly spent. A thin bar of daylight finds its way around the edge of the drawn curtain and lies across the foot of the narrow bed, moving with agonizing slowness across the worn blanket as the hours pass, the way daylight always does for anyone patient or exhausted enough to actually watch it happen. Tom's arms ache in the way they ache every single day at this hour. A deep, familiar soreness settled into his shoulders and forearms that he no longer expects to be otherwise. There is a small red mark along his forearm from the peel's near miss earlier this morning, already fading, already, he suspects, destined to join the faint collection of similar small marks that Walter carries in greater number, the quiet physical record of years spent at this trade. On the narrow shelf beside his bed sits the penny adventure story, tucked half open where he left it 2 nights ago, waiting for whatever few unhurried minutes he might find for it tomorrow, or the day after that. Downstairs, in a small ledger Mrs. Hollis keeps behind the counter, tomorrow's obligations are already written, the coffee house order confirmed for the same early hour, an additional 12 loaves promised to a family marking a christening, the flour merchant's cart expected mid-week with the next delivery of sacks. The day that has just finished, in other words, has already begun again on paper, quietly waiting, the way it always is, for 11 o'clock to arrive and call Tom back down those cellar steps to start the whole patient, exhausting, essential process over. That is tomorrow's story, though, and tomorrow can wait. For now, in this narrow room under the eaves, with the curtain drawn and the city's ordinary daylight business carrying on without him just beyond the glass, Tom sleeps the way only a truly spent body sleeps. Deeply. Entirely. Without dreams he will remember. His breathing slow and even, flour dust still faintly visible in the creases of his knuckles even after washing. The smell of last night's ovens still somewhere in the fabric of his shirt hung over the chair beside the bed. Somewhere below him, the shop continues its bright, ordinary business. Customers coming and going for bread they will eat without a second thought. Warmed by the very labor that is, right now, finally allowed to rest. The cellar sits empty and cooling. The fire is out, the troughs are scrubbed clean and waiting, and the boy who spent the whole of the night turning flour and water and patience into the thing that fed an entire corner of London this morning lies utterly still, utterly quiet, in a small room at the top of a house on Turnmill Street, while the ordinary day goes on without him, exactly as it was always meant to. The house is quiet, the street outside carries on without noticing. Tomorrow begins before today has entirely finished, the way it always does in a trade like this one, the fire already waiting to be built again before the last of tonight's warmth has fully faded from the brick. But that is a story for another night. For now, wherever you are, whatever hour it happens to be where you are resting, I hope this one kept you good company, friend. Sleep well.